Hello and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 155 of the Forge of Freedom. Today I've got a story to share with you. It's actually a story that was shared with me by a friend of mine, Everett Snyder. He's a range master certified advanced firearms instructor, and he's from Indiana as well. But he shared this article with me. It's a story from The Blaze, and I'll link to the article in the show notes. But the article is about an incident that occurred in Michigan, actually in Detroit, at a Detroit Lions football game. And this individual apparently pulled a gun and shot a man who in self-defense. But when he shot this attacker in self-defense, the single shot that he took, not only fatally wounded the attacker, but it also fatally wounded an innocent bystander. And the prosecutor in Wayne County, which is the county where Detroit is located, said that there would be no prosecution against the shooter because he acted in lawful self-defense. But what's interesting about this story and the question that was posed by my friend Everett, it was whether or not, if this had occurred in Indiana, whether or not Indiana's self-defense immunity statute would have applied. And just before I answer that question, I want to give a little bit of background. So Indiana has a self-defense statute, and that statute is codified in Indiana Code 35-41-3-2. And in part, it says that a person is justified in using reasonable force against any other person to protect the person or a third person from what the person reasonably believes to be the imminent use of unlawful force. However, a person is justified in using deadly force and does not have a duty to retreat if the person reasonably believes that force is necessary to prevent serious bodily injury to the person or a third person or the commission of a forcible felony. And so here, I think that the circumstances that brought about, if you analyze the circumstances from this Detroit Lions tailgate incident, I think that the Indiana self-defense statute would also apparently apply, knowing what we know from this Blaze article anyway. But the question is whether the person who acted in self-defense would be immune from civil lawsuit by the family or relatives of the innocent bystander who was also killed. And I think the answer is no, but I want to explain why and why I think that this is something important to consider. And just to give a little bit more background here, Indiana, as I alluded to, has a self-defense immunity statute, which is codified under 34-30-31-1. And I'll link to both of these statutes as well as the stories that I'm talking about here. I'll link to all of it in the show notes. But that statute, the self-defense immunity statute, says that the justified use of force, as described under 35-41-3-2, which is the self-defense statute, provides a complete immunity against any claim or action initiated by a person who alleges to have been injured or damaged by any such use of force. And this is the important part with respect to the incident in Michigan, whose conduct justified the use of force. In no case shall any use of force justified under Indiana Code 35-31-3-2 give rise to any claim or action for damages or compensation against a person, employer, or estate of a person using such force by or on behalf of any person who was attempting to commit or committing a forcible felony at the time such force was used, or was attempting to cause or causing unlawful serious bodily injury to any other person at the time such force was used. And this statute is a relatively, and I say relatively new with respect to the law. It's a relatively new law passed in 2019. And this statute, this immunity statute, was adopted after an incident involving a lady named Kystie Phillips. And Kystie Phillips was, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say a hero. She saved, or at least very likely saved, the life, or at least saved conservation officer from serious bodily harm during an encounter with a person who was under the influence of illegal substances. And this was back in 2017. And Kystie Phillips, this was in Ohio County in Indiana, and the conservation officer was off duty, but he had his son with him, and he was checking on a report of a suspicious person who had been acting erratically in a vehicle. I guess this person had been taking his shoes on and off and crawling around on his belly under a vehicle and up through the bed of a truck, and had just been acting really odd. So this conservation officer was responding to this report of a person behaving strangely. But when the officer responded, the encounter turned into a violent confrontation. And Kystie Phillips was there when it happened. She said that the guy had been screaming profanities and was beating on him, and the officer could not seem to diffuse the situation. And at one point, Kisti saw the man who had been acting erratically reach for the officer's weapon, and that's when she drew her own, and she fired a shot at the man who had been acting strangely, and she killed him. And apparently, under Indiana statute, I think was clearly an act of defense of another under Indiana's self-defense statute, and she was not prosecuted criminally. However, the family of the man who was now deceased brought civil suit against Kystie Phillips. And after much time in court, and certainly anybody who's been into court, whether it's civil or criminal case, understands through much stress and anxiety, the case was eventually dismissed. But as a result of this case and the injustice of it, the Indiana legislature passed a law, and that was this self-defense civil immunity law that I shared with you earlier under Indiana Code 34-30-31-1. And what's interesting about this law, and what I think is probably unique about it as compared to other states who may have similar laws, is that if the prosecutor in Indiana determines that there was a lawful act of self-defense and declines to prosecute, that provides a prima facie basis for the application of the immunity, and the burden is on the plaintiff, the person who's trying to sue the person who acted in self-defense, to oppose a motion for summary judgment, which is basically a motion to throw the case out. But if the plaintiff can't carry that burden, they face the statutory provision for attorney fees and costs that the defendant, the person who acted in self-defense, incurred. So there's some teeth to it. They can't just bring a a case and force the person to go through this litigation and the possibility of extracting some settlement without having to overcome a substantial hurdle and the possibility of having to pay the person who acted in self-defense attorney fees. So I think that's the interesting thing here. But with all that being said, how does this apply to our fact scenario from Detroit? Remember, there the person who acted in self-defense was not prosecuted criminally, but could they have been sued civilly by the person, the innocent bystander who was shot, or by the family of the innocent bystander who was shot? And could they be sued civilly? So there won't be any criminal prosecution if this had occurred in Indiana, more than likely, just like the prosecutor's refusal to prosecute in Michigan. But in Indiana, at least, I don't think the self-defense immunity statute would apply because, remember, it says, and this is the important thing to keep in mind, the immunity statute says whose conduct justified the use of force. So the justified use of force provides a complete immunity against any claim or action initiated by a person whose conduct justified the use of force. Well, that incident in Michigan, the innocent bystander's conduct is not what justified the use of force. And so if this had happened in Indiana, I don't believe that the person acting in self-defense would be immune from civil suit by the family or the estate of the deceased innocent bystander. And so while I think that the civil immunity statute is a powerful tool, it doesn't provide complete immunity. And I think that strikes a good balance here, because while it may not have been criminal to hit an innocent bystander while acting in self-defense, although some might argue that it was reckless to some degree, depends on the circumstances. We don't know enough of the facts to make that determination. It nevertheless provides for the possibility that it could have been negligent, which is the standard for a civil case. It's a much lower standard than what's required in a criminal case. So theoretically, someone could be negligent but not criminally liable. And so I think that here the Indiana self-defense immunity statute accounts for that possibility, and accounts for situations like what occurred at this Detroit Lions tailgate. So I love the question, and I want to shout out to Everett for passing along this story and for asking the question. But the other thing I want to point out before I close up here is that this is why so many instructors, and a lot of the best instructors, emphasize Rule 4. And what do I mean when I say Rule 4? Well, generally, there are 4 universal gun safety rules, or rules for safe gun handling, that are taught. Number 1, treat all guns as if they are loaded. Never let the muzzle point at anything that you are not willing to destroy. Number 3, keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on target and you have made the decision to shoot. And number 4, be sure of your target and what is behind it. Okay, you should always follow every single one of these rules, even when acting in self-defense. Okay, because if you don't, as with the situation in Detroit, okay, you may hit an innocent person. Number 4, be sure of your target and what is behind it. Because when the person acted in self-defense, lawfully shooting their attacker, there was an innocent bystander directly behind, or nearly directly behind, the attacker, and was unfortunately shot and killed as well by the same bullet that killed the attacker. So know your target and what's behind it. My father, Mike, and I, we did a episode dedicated to the rules of safe gun handling. So I'll link to that as well if you're interested in a more in-depth discussion of those rules. But anyway, I thought this was an interesting thought exercise. Like I said, this Indiana self-defense immunity statute doesn't apply to this situation because the incident occurred in another state. But I think it's for that reason, an interesting thought experiment. And I think was worthwhile thinking back to the story about Kystie Phillips and how she heroically intervened to save the conservation officer who was uh, under attack by a person who was under the influence of illegal drugs, and how she went through the pain so that if any of us are in a similar situation going forward, hopefully we don't have to go through the same thing she did. So once again, I'll link to all those in the show notes. I hope this makes sense. I hope that the Indiana self-defense immunity statute is a little more clear to you now and how that might apply in these sorts of situations. And I've got 3 articles here about the Kystie Phillips situation, but I'm also going to link to an article about the 4 rules of gun safety in the podcast that I recorded with my father, Mike, about those rules as well. So definitely go back and listen to those and read those articles. I think we always tell people these safety rules should be second nature. You should have these so that you know them at an unconsciously competent level. Okay, so you don't have to think about them. You just act them out by habit, these safety rules. And so I think that's I think something that far too many gun owners take too lightly. And I think that just like we say all the time with this show, personal responsibility is one of the keys to maintaining, preserving, and winning back our freedom. And that applies in so many areas, but especially with respect to our right to self-defense and our right to keep and bear arms. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned a little something. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. That helps us spread the message of liberty, this message of freedom. It helps us reach other people who might find this content to be interesting and informative as well. As always, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, X, and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.